It seems a common reply to the arguments from natural theology is to cry God of the gaps. In my experience, a skeptic of theism will often use this as a last resort argument. The argument tends to go like, all you have done is found something not explained by science and filled it with God. It is not a real explanation, and one day science will account for this without God, like we have done in the past with several things like lightning and earthquakes. Ancient people used to think these things were caused by gods, and present-day arguments for God's existence are exactly the same. The problem with this line of reasoning is that it's an abuse of how the actual fallacy was supposed to be used, and it is based on a misunderstanding of history. First, the God of the Gaps fallacy was actually created by a Christian evangelist named Henry Drummond, and it was never meant to apply to metaphysical theories. The phrase was meant to be used when one inserts divine intervention into a biological process or a physical process. For example, we can't explain how elephants evolved from primitive mammals, therefore it was miraculous. We can't explain the order of certain orbital levels of electrons, therefore it is run by divine intervention. We can't explain how fish evolved into tetrapods, therefore divine intervention happened. However, Drummond encouraged his fellow Christians to accept all of nature as the product of God's work. In other words, the intricacies of natural processes, still unanswered by science, don't need divine intervention inserted into them. But all of nature itself still implies the existence of a creator who set natural processes into motion. Inserting God into a natural process is not how most arguments for God's existence function. See, arguments for God's existence are philosophical in nature. We take scientific data and infer a philosophical or metaphysical theory that we believe best fits with the data. For example, materialism is a metaphysical theory of reality, not a scientific theory. Materialism is the idea all that exists is matter, and the complex arrangements of matter. This cannot be proven by science, only inferred philosophically. Now, if a materialist was to argue that from something we observe in science was evidence in favor of materialism, it would be absurd for me to reply that they are just trying to explain that with the materialism of the gaps. And that is how ridiculous it sounds when a non-theist attempts to argue a God of the gaps in response to the arguments from natural theology or the metaphysical theory of theism. Theists are not actually arguing from a gap in a natural process, but arguing for a metaphysical theory of reality, which attempts to explain why there are natural processes, or what is the best way to explain reality. Metaphysical theories attempt to explain all of reality and what reality is. When a theist argues God exists from arguments used in natural theology, one is not arguing from a gap in our knowledge with regards to how natural processes work, but arguing a whole scientific process or certain data infers a theistic worldview. That is by definition not arguing from a gap, but arguing our full understanding of science infers a theistic worldview. For example, cosmological arguments do not argue for a gap in the evolution of the universe, but they argue the universe, as a whole, has a necessary and sentient cause. Teleological arguments do not argue from gaps within physical processes, but argues the fine-tuning of the universe, as a whole, leads to design. Saying these and other similar arguments, or arguing from gaps, would be as absurd as saying the theory of gravity is a gap filler until we find a better explanation. The theory of gravity, which almost everyone accepts, is the best way to explain certain observable phenomena. We have observed data in physical reality and came up with a theory of gravity to best explain this data. It would be absurd for someone, like a flat earther, to say gravity is just a gap filler, and that we can't explain why objects fall to the earth, so we have just inserted our made-up theory of gravity into this process. A logical person would just respond that gravity is simply the best explanation of observable data. If one day we find a better explanation, then it will replace gravity, but currently it is not just a gap filler. And when theists argue that all of reality is best explained by theism, we are not arguing from a gap in our knowledge with regards to physical or biological processes. We are arguing like one argues from the evidence for the theory of gravity. Also, we should note science is not burying theism. The best arguments for God's existence have come about from modern advancements in science from within the past 100 years. So the current arguments for God's existence don't compare to ancient beliefs in natural gods that cause lightning or earthquakes. The more science reveals, the more evidence we have for God's existence, as I've argued in past videos. When non-theists try to use the God of the gaps argument in response to natural theology, in reality, they only shoot themselves in the foot. First, saying evidence which implies theism will be overturned by people in the future is nothing more than arguing a future humans of the gaps argument. One is essentially saying, I don't know the answer to this, but I know more intelligent people in the future will have an answer, and I know it will fit my worldview of non-theism. Instead of offering a better explanation of the data to counter theism, one has filled a gap in their worldview with the unknown knowledge of future humans. You don't know what the future will bring, so you just can't assume more intelligent individuals in the future will find an explanation that is better than a theistic one. This is just an attempt to ignore a clear problem for a non-theistic worldview and hoping and believing it will one day go away. One does not really provide an answer, but just assumes their worldview is already correct on blind faith, and places their faith in future humans to confirm what they want to be true. Second, notice what they have admitted without realizing it. They have not explained how materialism, or other non-theistic views, can account for these pieces of data, but admitted these are gaps in the materialist or naturalistic view of reality. Non-theistic views cannot fully explain the data the theists have offered, and they only hope it will be explained in the future. So in saying these arguments are God of the gaps arguments, they simply assume the worldview and inadvertently admit these are gaps in their philosophical view of reality that their non-theistic theory of reality cannot account for. Thus, in reality, they admit theism is the better explanation of reality if they cannot account for this data through a materialistic worldview, or offer a better and more parsimonious explanation. Thus, when a non-theist cries God of the gaps, they are not really addressing any arguments for God's existence, but admitting to us all they are just assuming their worldview that God doesn't exist, and any evidence for God cannot possibly mean that God exists. So it must just be a gap until someone comes along and solves this issue for their worldview. All they do is admit their view of reality cannot explain as much as theism can, and there are clear gaps they cannot account for within their framework. So in reality, crying God of the gaps in response to natural theology only creates more problems for the non-theist than it solves.